this piece around we are very different, but we also have some things that are similar, or to use Mark Twain's quote, that they rhyme with one another. And I think there are moments in the book that I very intentionally try to write in a way that I hope some Americans can be like, wait a second, that seems like something we're dealing with in America, even though she's writing about Egypt. And so I hope that through that story, my set of stories in the book, that people can start to see how we're all kind of struggling with the same kinds of things, and some of the tension points that we have in a lot of different cultures around the world are actually not so dissimilar, and that I think we also have a lot to learn from one another. And I think, sometimes Americans especially have a tendency to believe that people can learn from us and not so much that we can learn from them. And so I hope that maybe people can say, hey, like maybe we should look across to other places and get some inspiration of how we can solve our problems here, because others have tried solving them previously.
Hey, it's Dave. I love that thought. Mark Twain, that we need to rhyme with each other. Catherine Manfre is here with us. Her book, Not There Yet, it's a memoir. She captures how going and living in Egypt has impacted her personally and her family and her life. Great conversation. Catherine is so amazing in this episode. I'm so happy I had a chance to talk. Here we go. Welcome to the podcast. Happy to have everyone joining us today. Catherine is here with us to talk authorship, to talk books, but please, everyone, keep it down. Because Catherine's got a napping toddler in the house, so we want to make sure that we don't make too much noise during the podcast. So everyone just kind of keep it down a little bit. I really appreciate that. Catherine, welcome to the podcast. We'll try to do our best to not wake anybody that's sleeping at the moment.
All good, Dave. Thanks for having me. And she is a very blissful sleeper, so I would doubt that we could make enough noise to wake her up.
A blissful sleeper. I think that is now going to be my new shirt title. I'm going to have that on a shirt because that's what I love. I love sleeping. So you got me right there. I promise we won't put anybody else to sleep during this podcast.
Let's hope not.
But yeah, so nice to have you with us. Tell everybody where you are in the world as we're recording today.
Absolutely. I am sitting in Washington, D.C. It is a balmy 75 degrees in the middle of October. We're getting some sort of bizarre weather, but we'll take it. And I've already done our fill of outside activities to make sure that we take advantage of this surprisingly warm and beautiful October day.
Yes. And as we mentioned, I feel a little bit odd. I feel like I'm robbing you of your day, but you're making time, and I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. We're up here in Canada. I know it's a fall day. It's bright and sunny, but a little cool. So it's nice to hear that you're having great weather and everything. Thank you for making time. Tell us a little bit about your book. I'm excited to hear the story of how you've written this, and we'll get into all that great stuff. First of all, the name of the book and a little bit about it.
Absolutely. So the book is called Not There Yet. And it is about my journey to living in Egypt for 4 years, which included the time period during the 2011 Egyptian Revolution. And while most of the book does take place in Egypt and is about my experience first as a study abroad student and then living there full time, about my journey living through the revolution and meeting my husband, who is Egyptian, it also makes some parallels to some things going on in the United States and is meant to really inspire activism and for people to stay awake to the things that are going on in our own country from some of the lessons that I learned living through the revolution in Egypt.
How does going to another country expand somebody's worldview and give you a different perspective? I'm interested to know the Catherine before Egypt and the Catherine after Egypt, just to see what that experience taught you. Tell me a little bit about you before you went there and kind of your worldview prior to going to Egypt.
So I grew up in a small town in Northeast Florida, which is where the book begins. And I talk about how one of the really pivotal days in my life, and I think many people's lives across the world, was 9/11. And that's kind of where the book starts. And that, for me, inspired a lot of feelings as a 14-year-old high school freshman. Just started my freshman year of high school, and one of the things it inspired was a really long list of questions about why the attacks happened, where these people came from, but in questioning where all of those reasons for why those attacks happened, it also led me to a series of questions that led me to Egypt, actually. And I think part of why and there's, a number of steps in between those events of 9/11 and moving to Egypt. But I think the thing that has remained consistent about me is this constant need to understand and question. And I think that was what led me to wanting to learn more about the Middle East and Islam and what it was about this culture that, partially could have inspired those attacks. But more importantly, I think to just learn about another culture that I had never really heard of up until then at that point in my life as a 14-year-old. And I think that constant curiosity was something that served me really well when I studied abroad in Egypt, and that partially what led me to live there for 4 years, because I had this desire to just keep learning more about the culture. And I think that, there are a lot of issues in society today around our ability to talk with one another, especially when we come from different places or different backgrounds. But I think that ability to ask questions and wanting to understand and learn is something that, it was a part of me before I went to Egypt, but I think it was something I really appreciated as being sort of vitally important for my ability to both live there and make friends and form relationships, but also to come away with a really deep appreciation for the culture and the religion.
Jump back to the events around 9/11. How did that personally impact you? Like, as soon as you mentioned 9/11 to most people, they can take you to the moment where they were, what they were doing, what was happening that day for them. And it's just something that's kind of ingrained in us. And now there's another generation coming that has never experienced that before. So they've been born and grown up after the fact. So I always love to kind of take people back there, because it's a thing that I don't think anyone should ever forget. And that story should never be silenced. Where were you on that day? And what was the impact to you on that day? Take me back there a little moment.
Absolutely. So, one question I've gotten from people as I've written this book was, oh, you must have, written a lot of journals. Like, is that how you were able to put this together? And I've never been a big journaler. And so, the fact that I wrote a memoir strikes some people as odd, having not had that base. But I think that 9/11 is one of those days, like you said, where even if you haven't written anything down about your memory of that day, it's like every minute has been sort of etched into your brain, and it's almost impossible to forget some of the really, really minor details that on a normal average every other day, you would probably forget or would sort of average together from all the other days that you've experienced. And so on that day, I was, like I said, a freshman in high school. I just started high school a few weeks earlier, so I was kind of new and overwhelmed, and like so many new freshmen in high school, really unclear of my social status and like who my friends were and where my classes were and homework and tests and all of that. And so I was in the middle of we had like a big gap between our first and second period of the day when a fellow student ran down the hallway yelling that a plane had run into or had hit the World Trade Center. And we were in Northeast Florida. People didn't really know where that was or what the building was necessarily. And we also, and I think this is a sign of how naive we were, we all assumed that it was an accident. And I remember some of my peers saying, well, that's ridiculous. Like, how could someone miss the World Trade Center? I mean, couldn't they have swerved around it? And we just all assumed that it was engine failure or like a small plane that, had lost its course. And it wasn't until we were sitting in our classroom, several minutes later, and my teacher had turned the news on, which was already unusual, and we saw the second plane hit, that I think it started to dawn on us and probably many other people watching that it was intentional. And I just remember not being able to comprehend that someone planned to do something like that. And of course, from, history class, you learn about all of the atrocities of world history, and you sort of know generally that bad things happen and people plan to do bad things. But seeing it in real time as a teenager was really remarkable and very difficult to understand. And I think for many months later, my friends and I, who were all, fairly, even at that young age, fairly aware of world events, spent a lot of time talking about it and really just trying to grapple with how someone could come to the conclusion to harm so many people. And I think the overwhelming emotion I had was not fear, which I think is what a lot of the adults around me at least seem to feel. I think it was really just confusion. But also, like I said, this intense curiosity to just understand more. And I think that was sort of my coping mechanism, was learning as much as I could.
It's one thing to learn about a story in history class that happened to someone else at a different time in a different place. But because you have hindsight, you can look back, you can see the lesson, you can see how things kind of fell into place for this event to have happened. But to be in history class, witnessing history, you're part of the story, you're part of it, and you're feeling it in real time. It gives you a completely different perspective. And you feel like you're part of the event, even though you're miles away. You still feel like you're part of what's happening, right? And it shapes you. How did that moment shape you or reshape how you think, which kind of leads you down the path of ending up in Egypt? How did the moment shape you, even at a young age? Like
I said, I think that a lot of it was this desire to understand. And one really pivotal relationship that I began about a year after 9/11 that I talk about quite a bit in the book was my current sort of lifelong best friend moving to our town. Her name is Arfa, and she's Pakistani American. Her parents immigrated to the United States from Pakistan, and her siblings were all born here. And they had moved to our town the following year. She was a year older than me, and we very quickly fell into this friendship. And the friendship was founded on the same things any friendship is in high school. We talked about boys and music and gossip and classwork. But the other part of our friendship was her also very compassionately and openly talking about her religion. She was Muslim, and her family was Muslim, and her culture, and sort of entertaining my thousands of questions about all of the things that I had sort of read about. And, especially in the news media, if you remember at that time, was not very kind to Muslims. And I, even though Arfa was really the first Muslim I ever remember at least knowing, and certainly the first Muslim that I was friends with, at least at that point, I just remember feeling like there's no way these headlines can be true. And there's no way it could be all Muslims. There's no way that some of the rhetoric around the religion could possibly be true. And that was that feeling was confirmed through my friendship with her, because she is, one of the most incredible people I've ever met. Her family was and is incredibly open and compassionate and kind and warm. And I think that the thing about that relationship, building on the experience of living through 9/11, was that these people were outliers that did this, and that it is not appropriate to be painting everyone with a broad brush, because you lose the opportunity to form relationships and connections and have really meaningful conversations when you do that. And so I think that was really one of the things that I took away from the combination of 9/11 and this relationship with Arfa. And, she validated this curiosity I had that led me to studying the Middle Eastern studies in college, which sort of led me to getting myself involved in a study abroad program in Egypt.
That's amazing how that connection opened that door for you, right? I love that you connected with her, and then that led to a path maybe you might not have chosen or been led to had you not had that connection. And I think the fact you talk about the broad brush, I love that, because as you're talking about it, in my head, I'm thinking, wide brush, and you're saying broad brush. I'm like, that's it. And in our ignorance, we seem to paint with a broad brush because other people aren't like us, so they must be like this. If they don't fit into my category, they must fit into this category. And that's not true for everyone. And I've actually heard people say, well, I don't know how to pronounce it, so it's not important. That's a different language than English, and it is important, and it's important to them. And we can't think that just because somebody's not like us or speaks like us or thinks like us, that they don't have value. So can you kind of go off on that a little bit? Because I feel that's where you're heading, and I think it's so important that people hear
Absolutely. this. Absolutely. I think it is all of those things that you just mentioned. And I think that one of the downfalls, I think, of the way social media is constructed and the way our news media is constructed is we do make these broad generalizations, and the way the algorithms work sometimes sort of put us in a space where it's easy to believe some of those broad generalizations. And every person is an individual. I mean, I talk about this in the book, like Arfa, like she loves rap music. Like, I don't know that all Pakistani Americans love rap music, but she does. And so that, I give that detail to just suggest that when you fall into these stereotypes, and if you fall into this trap of believing that a group of people all thinks the same way or believes the same things or wants the same outcomes to happen, it makes it really difficult to have genuine conversations. And, the other big date that the book is kind of constructed around three main dates, 9/11 and January 25th, which is the day the Egyptian Revolution started, and then January 6th of 2021, the day of the insurrection in Washington, D.C. And the reason I bring up January 6th in relationship to the question that you asked is I think that part of the challenge with what led up to that and what has happened since is that we are not able to have these one-to-one conversations with each other because we all have these assumptions about what we believe. And I think it also has led many of us to look at validating media that makes us believe the things we already believed instead of challenging our assumptions or in some cases the set of facts that we believe. And I think that, one-on-one conversations are not going to solve all of our problems, but I certainly think that without them, it is going to be far more difficult to make any kind of progress together.
So you talk a little bit about outsiders coming to the U.S., to Canada, coming to a Western culture and trying to find their home and make a home here. As somebody who maybe, met people who were coming here and learned more about other cultures, you're really not the outsider in that situation, but the moment you land in Egypt and you experience a new culture, you switch gears from being someone where people come to your culture to being somebody going to their culture. How does it feel for you? Can you kind of take us back to the early days in Egypt for you as you become, in effect, the outsider in a new culture, and now you're having to adapt? How did that feel to switch gears and become the guest?
I mean, I think it broadly makes me feel like how I think my toddler feels on a day-to-day basis, which is trying to learn all of these very basic things. Like right now, we're in the middle of potty training. And so she's learning how to use the toilet for the first time. And it felt like that. It was like everything I was doing was for the first time. In fact, to pivot from that specific reference that I made to my daughter's potty training, one of the things I mentioned, I get off the plane and I think this is not uncommon in many countries, but at that point I had not been to countries where this was common, so it was weird and uncommon for me. I had, gone to the bathroom like most people do after a 12-hour flight. And there was a woman sitting in the bathroom in a kind of uniform who handed me toilet paper. And I was incredibly confused. I was like, why is this woman handing me toilet paper? Why is there not toilet paper in the bathroom? And so I went in the bathroom. There was not toilet paper except for the toilet paper this woman had handed me. I, went to the bathroom, came out, and then the woman asked me for, change, some cash. And I, gave her a couple dollars, which I didn't have Egyptian currency at the time. And it was just, a very, very small example of something that was different than what I would have expected or what I would have assumed to be a routine process, which is, going to the bathroom in an airport, not anything to write home about. But that was just one example of a series of examples that I talk about in the book as I both studied abroad in Egypt and then later moved to Egypt full time and had these sort of succession of things that just were not what I would have thought they were going to be. And it felt like learning to live kind of all over again from scratch.
It takes you out of your element. And like you said, it makes you rethink everything. And then there's a language component to this as well, right? But what did you enjoy? What were you surprised about Egypt culture that you're like, I had no idea, or I'm fascinated, about this? What kind of caught your attention when you were there?
That's a really tough question to answer, as I feel like I could probably talk for like hours on the answer to that question. I think that, on its surface, if you ever go to Cairo, Cairo is a city of 20-ish million people. It is big. It is chaotic. There are not obvious road rules to someone coming from North America. And it is loud and, sort of dirty, and there's pollution. And like, it just feels like all of your senses, all 5 of your senses are just kind of getting attacked on like a minute to minute basis. And it can feel really, really overwhelming. But one of the things that I think I experienced very early on and was continued to be true. And, my husband is Egyptian, so I have Egyptian in-laws, and I've now experienced what I'm about to describe in a lot more detail, which is the hospitality of Egyptians. And I think I recount a story in the book about one time where my friends and I got lost, and we asked someone where we were trying to go and how to get there. And the person just like walked us there, and it was like not close by. It wasn't on their way. And they just, made sure that we got to where we were going. And that kind of, like desire to help people, even total strangers. I mean, frankly, I have not experienced that so frequently in the United States. I've lived in several cities. I would say usually when you try to go up to a stranger and ask them for help, like a lot of people just kind of blow you off. Not always, but more often than not, I think. I know you're in Canada, so like it's a little different. I think people are like maybe a little bit kinder there. Yeah. But in Egypt, like, you could ask anyone for directions or for help, and almost without fail, they would make sure to help you. Another example of this was during Ramadan. Muslims will fast from the time the sun rises to the time the sun sets. And when you get close to the time that the sun sets, people are breaking their fast for the day. And so they're all trying to rush home so that they can like get something to eat. And there will be people that will stand in the middle of the road and give out either dates or like small cups of juice to people that are stuck in traffic so that people can break their fast if they are not able to get home on time. And so again, those are just 2 examples, but this is like something that if you just go to Cairo to visit, you might not pick up on, because you're just assaulted by like all of these like, sounds and sights and smells. But if you get to spend a little bit more time there, you get to experience this incredible hospitality that was just, I think, probably one of the things that was the most surprising I wasn't expecting.
Okay, so when was the last time that you were there?
I was there. I think it was about 4 years ago. COVID has, obviously put on pause many a travel plan between having a baby and COVID. We haven't been back in a bit, but it's been about 4 years since I've been able to visit.
What is your hope for your daughter as far as making the trek there someday? What do you think, whether that's later on in life for her, teenage years, or whatever, as she gets this book that she can read from her mom, what do you think that she might experience? And what would be your hope for her now that you're on the other side of this? And I'm just curious to see what your hopes are for her.
I think my biggest hope is that she can feel comfortable in both places. both in Egypt and in America. And, there are obviously some things about both countries that are similar. There are obviously many things that are different, but I think they both are places where modernity and conservatism sort of live side by side with one another. And they are both places where people want freedom and people are maybe trying to make sure that we have less of it. And there are people that are open-minded and there are people that are closed-minded. And I think one of my takeaways from living in Egypt for 4 years is that there are so many things about everyone's culture and even individual culture down to the family level that are unique and different and special. And if you ask enough questions and have enough patience and understanding, you have the chance to actually understand and get to know. But at the same time, I also think there are a set of things that most people want that are very similar to one another. And I mention that because I think in my experience that trying to find some common ground, even if the common ground is very small, is sort of the way that you're able to start relationships and get to a place of understanding. And so I hope for her that kind of two things, that she can both have that for herself so that she can appreciate both of the cultures that are part of her heritage, but also that she can, fingers crossed, live in a world where more people can also appreciate one another's culture, or even if they don't understand it, that they can be open to learning it so that they can have a bit more understanding and be able to have more dialogue with one another.
And for us here in Canada, as we look across the river into America and watch all of the things that are going on with our neighbors to the south, that is our hope as well as your neighbors, is that we don't understand everything happening in the U.S., but the things that you're saying and the words and how you're framing your thoughts right now, I think if the U.S. and the population of the U.S. could have a similar voice and share this same passion for others that you're sharing, I think it could answer a lot of questions and relieve a lot of tension, really, in just how people treat each other. How do you think this book might help a reader understand others better and understand themselves? I think there's a few layers that I hope people take away. I think one is this layer that we've been talking about on how you can use curiosity and empathy and relationships and connection to be able to understand one another, regardless of what it is that is making you different. I think that's one layer. I think another layer is to be able to learn about Egypt. I mean, I did want people to come away with a very different understanding of a place that, maybe some people have visited for, 7 to 10 days and have done the Nile cruise and the pyramids, kind of the standard tourist package, but might not have had enough time to really get into the culture. And I really wanted to try to humanize Egypt herself and the culture, and for people to be like, hey, this doesn't seem like such a scary place. These people seem great. So I genuinely hope that people, people from Canada and the United States specifically can come away with a more nuanced understanding of a part of the world that I think sometimes somewhat unfairly gets depicted in a scary way in a lot of our news media and pop culture. And so I hope that people can maybe feel like it's a little less scary and a little bit more accessible. And then I think the third layer is that this piece around we are very different, but we also have some things that are similar, or to use Mark Twain's quote, that they rhyme with one another. And I think there are moments in the book that I very intentionally try to write in a way that I hope some Americans can be like, wait a second, that seems like something we're dealing with in America, even though she's writing about Egypt. And so I hope that through that story, my set of stories in the book, that people can start to see how we're all kind of struggling with the same kinds of things. And some of the tension points that we have in a lot of different cultures around the world are actually not so dissimilar. And that I think we
also have a lot to learn from one another. And I think, sometimes Americans especially have a tendency to believe that people can learn from us and not so much that we can learn from them. And so I hope that maybe people can say, hey, like maybe we should look across to other places and get some inspiration of how we can solve our problems here because others have tried solving them previously.
Catherine, wow. I love listening to you, and I love how you form your thoughts, and you come with such passion, and that's why I love having a podcast, is having people come on and share their journey, because you just learn so much just by listening. Again, there's another thing that we don't do well, and a great reason why there is podcasts is whether you're listening to this podcast or just me being with you today, just listening helps open your mind and thinking differently. I love it. So, okay, so this is a memoir. Can you talk to our author friends listening? Maybe they're at the beginning or thinking of writing a memoir. What's the power of writing a memoir? Where do you start? That's probably my first question is for a new author that wants to write a memoir. I want to write something powerful. I want to capture my story. Where do I start, Catherine? How do I do that?
So I think the first thing is to just write and write anything and to write really, really badly. And then, the other thing advice I will give, and I think this might be a little controversial, is not to have a plan or a goal. And I say this as like the most type A planning, like spreadsheets. I have an MBA. Like I was a management consultant for 8 years. Like I'm all about planning, strategies, like having everything well documented. So I just want to like give your listeners that background as someone who like makes spreadsheets about my vacations. For me to say to not have a plan is like not part of like my character generally. But the reason I say that is, so I think as we've mentioned, like, I was a first-time parent when I started this book. My daughter was less than a year old when I first started writing it, and I was working a more than full-time job at that time, and it was not easy to squeeze this in. And I think the way that I got it done was I didn't say, I'm going to sit down and write a book. I said, I'm going to take this writing program, and which I did, and I'm just going to see what happens. Like, I'm just going to write. I'll, take their direction. And one of the things this program I did had coached us on was just to write like short snippets, like 100 to 200 word paragraphs, just to get things on paper. And even though I had like some of the ideas that we've talked about in the back of my mind as to why I wanted to write the book, I didn't have an outline. I didn't have chapters. I didn't have a really clear set of stories even that I wanted to tell. I mean, I had some of them, of course, like kind of in the back of my mind. But I sort of allowed myself, probably for one of the first times in my life, actually, to just say, I'm not going to try to write a book. I'm just going to try to write. And that freedom to not feel like I needed to get it done actually relieved, I think, a lot of the pressure and some of the blocks that I think can sometimes happen when you're trying to write, because I was just sort of writing for a while, and it took some time before the book actually had the structure it did. And then there was a lot of work that happened after the manuscript first got written to like get to the point I'm at now. But I guess, like I said, I'm going to give some controversial advice, which is like to not have a plan right away and just to write. And like, I think that process of writing actually helped me to figure out what I was trying to say in a way that had I tried to figure out what I wanted to say first, it would have been harder to fill in the words to make the book happen.
The interesting parallel that I'm drawing while you're speaking, and I'm enjoying this, is earlier you talked about, the typical tour through Cairo, and you kind of see the sights and do the tourist thing. That seems a typical way. And then the moment you can step off the tour is when you really connect. And in writing this book, there's the typical way, and then there's the way you've done it. You stepped off the tour. I'm going to do something a little different, a little controversial. I'm going to do it my way and see how this goes. You kind of paralleled the two, just even in your writing and your process. It's quite interesting. Can tell me about the moment when the book is done and you're like, it's done. Like, I hear a lot of authors talk about it's like a birth. It's like a new thing you've created. The pride that comes to you as an author when you know it's complete. And then those early comments that come into you from readers and people in your community. How does that reinforce for you as an author that you're on the right path?
Yeah, I think I'll answer that with telling the story of when I sort of realized I had written a book. I'd had some very gracious friends who had read it and had given me both constructive and supportive, thoughts about how to improve it along the way. And there are several people in my life that I document pretty in a lot of detail in the book, and they, had an active role in how I described our relationship and some of the events that I talk about. But the moment of like pride that you're mentioning came about when I received my copies of my book, and my daughter, who I'd talked to her about the fact that Mama was writing a book. She looked at the book and she said, "Mama's book." And, we have like several copies now like laying around my house. And every time she sees it, she says, "Mama's book." And there was something about that because, she really was a lot of the reason I finally sat down to write. She was a big part of the reason I felt really compelled to tell the story and to use the book as a little bit of a wake-up call for those that read it on the importance of staying engaged in these times. And so for her, again, she's 2.5. It's not like she's going to read the book necessarily, at least not right now. I think for her to realize that her mom wrote a book, that was just a really, really special moment that as much as I hope many people buy it and read it and enjoy it, I think that was probably the most special review I could have possibly gotten.
And reviews are so important for authors. I've heard so many people mention, if you buy my book online, please leave a review, because it really does help. We talk about it in podcasting. We love reviews as well. Everyone wants to review. It's great. But for authors particularly, I really get the sense that it does mean a lot for you as an author to hear that feedback. And that's something I always encourage people to do. So I want to speak to the person, Catherine, that's on Amazon today. They come across your book and they're about to click that purchase button. But they're like, I don't know if this book is for me. Let's just talk to that person for a second and just explain to them. And I love hearing it in the author's voice, why this book is something that you should purchase, and why this book should be meaningful to you as a reader.
So I think that my book is a unique way of learning about a totally different country and culture, Egypt. I think it is a solve for those that have felt the fear and uncertainty of these last few years living through COVID. I think that a lot of my experience in living through the Egyptian revolution in some ways parallels a lot of the feelings I know I've had, and I think many others have had, living through this period of time, and now having a desire to, build a world that is not the one that we had in 2020 before the lockdowns, but is a better one and a more, safe and understanding place for all of us. And I think the other thing is I hope for, especially folks that like me were, in their teenage years during 9/11, I hope a little bit of a coming of age and coming together of a very set of world events that we all sort of struggled through at a very formative time in our life. And I think that the last thing I would say is that I talk about a lot of very heavy, serious things in the book. I try to inject some humor along the way, but I also want people to know that it is also meant to be a message of hope, and a message that, we have all, as a globe, actually gone through a really traumatic set of events the last few years. And while there are a lot of scary things that lay in our path towards getting to a better and brighter future, I do think that there is a way for us to get there. And so I want people to also know that this is meant to be a hopeful book for us all to sort of collectively grieve and to reflect, but also to know that there is a path towards a better place. And as the title of the book says, we're not there yet in terms of where we might want to be, but we're also not there yet in terms of where we don't want to be. And so I think that this is really meant to be a book about needing to come together and make a decision about what kind of world we want in the future.
What's interesting too, Catherine, is I actually have listeners in Egypt.
Oh, great.
So this is kind of amazing that someone there will be hearing our voice and this conversation and hearing your kind words about your time in Egypt. So that's kind of surreal for me as a podcaster, that this is kind of, that's going to be part of this, the ongoing story that we get to share with people. Any greetings, any comments to those listening from Egypt, from you, that would be like super meaningful for a listener there as well?
Well, I will say, if you are Egyptian and you are listening to this, I have had multiple Egyptian friends, including my husband, review the book and have vetted it for its cultural accuracy, let's say, and the linguistic accuracy, because I do write a little bit in Arabic in the book. I will also say that what I've been told by some of my Egyptian friends who have read the book is that they have found it to be an interesting viewpoint into their own society and culture, because I think they have said that I have written about things that they would never have thought to explain if someone had ever asked them to explain Egypt or Cairo to them. And because, I was not Egyptian, I was picking up on things that, if you grow up in a certain culture, you just don't even know is different than your own. So I hope that maybe it can be both a callback to a different time, but also maybe I have written about things that, you might not have thought to explain to a foreigner coming to your country, or trying to explain to a foreigner outside of your country. So hopefully you agree with the representations more than anything.
I'm looking forward to book number 2. What's coming for you? What's down the road? We can't leave people hanging here.
Well, I'm not going to lie. I don't have a plan for what's down the road. I'm not there yet either. The title of the book has become a useful explainer of my future plans. No, I'm just kidding. I don't think this is going to be the last book I write. But I think right now I'm trying to focus just on getting the word out, allowing more people to be able to read it and give feedback. But I am really excited for people to start reading it and to get it out into the world. And I think that's kind of where I'm at right now. Okay. So how do we connect, Catherine? How do we find you? Where are you most active? As a reader, I would love to reach out. Where do I go? So you can find me on my website, catherinemanfre.com. Please feel free to send me a note in the contact form. You can also email me directly at hello@catherinemanfre.com. I'm on Instagram @CatherineManfre, and I'm also active on LinkedIn. I actually don't do Twitter, mostly for my own mental sanity. I am fairly confident that if I get sucked into the Twitter vortex, I might never emerge. So you cannot find me on Twitter. I might change my mind at some point about that. But for right now, Instagram, LinkedIn, and by email, and happy to connect. Amazing, Catherine Manfre. Thank you so much for making time to be on our podcast. And my encouragement to everyone is to go and please check out the links in the show notes. Go and check out Catherine's great book. A book like this is so valuable and so needed right now. And my hope is that, again, this isn't the last book, because I think you have a lot more to say. And I'm just encouraging you that I'm inspired just talking to you today. So thank you so much for being part of the podcast. Thank you so much, Dave. This has been a pleasure. Awesome. And we didn't wake anybody. She's still asleep. Mission accomplished. I love it. Thank you so much. Well, the podcast is over. Thank you for being a part of this episode. If this is your very first episode, welcome to Living the Next Chapter. You can go back in our catalog. You can see some of the past episodes. But if you want to get a sneak peek of what's coming, you want to jump the line? I got something for you. Go to our YouTube channel
Again, links are in the show notes and on our website, livingthenextchapter.com, and you can go to our YouTube channel and get the most recent episode way before everybody else. So we're putting this at the end of the podcast because we don't want to tell everyone. We don't want to have a stampede, But we're having some great conversations over on our YouTube channel. You're invited. You're this far. You're the one listening. You are invited to our YouTube channel. Go over there and you can see the most up-to-date episodes in real time. Meet you over there. Thanks for listening. Cheers.
Mindshift Power Podcast, the podcast for teenagers and those who work with them. There's a huge problem in America today. There's a very large disconnect between teenagers and the adults who work with them. I'm looking to bridge that gap with real, raw, honest conversation, not held back by the chains of political correctness. You cannot solve a problem you do not understand. Want to understand teenagers today? Listen to this podcast. This podcast is for teens in the U.S. and Canada. To learn more, go to fatimabay.com/podcast or just look for Mindshift Power Podcast on any listening platform. I look forward to you being a faithful listener.